Let's talk Bill C-9. Canada has officially passed a bill called Bill C-9. Bill C-9 is essentially a hate crime prevention bill, which according to the definitions as stated and proposed by said bill, which has just passed, we now see a problem of ethics essentially. In inconsistent specific interpretation of the way the billing is worded, you may find that ultimately it leaves the option for each individual to kind of manipulate the wording according to their bias. In the initial definition of hatred, we find the definition of hatred being the use of hate resulting in said emotion then pursuing to produce an act of hate, an act of hatred, a hate crime. And in these hate crimes, you might find that few definitions change essentially, which according to the definitions, you might find that upon presenting a religious or particular symbol, forget religious symbol for a second, but think about just any particular symbol that which causes an individual, which in said legislation, hatred or a hate crime may be such a thing as simply impeding an individual's path of travel or simply producing the emotion of fear within said group, which based on the definition of impinging in said legislation, you might find it states, I'm not going to go through the entire billing order, I could very well go through it in order to essentially find interpretive words, which leaves the individual being able to interpret said bill and create a bias from. Regardless of these particular wordings in said billing, essentially you find that in the definition of impinging an individual's right of path of travel can simply be stated in their definition as an individual that simply arises the emotion of fear within yourself. Which now if you simply base the definition of a particular symbol striking fear within said individual, you might find that even as something as wearing a hat will essentially cause an individual to feel fear or feel they are a victim of a hate crime based on a particular symbol, whichever said symbol may be. They list two particular symbols within said legislative examples, but those are not the entire list of said religious or non-religious symbols that specifically in the definition as impeding a person's path of travel may now be defined as simply striking the emotion of fear just by walking by them. If an individual feels fear based on said individual walking, they may now be defined in classification as an individual who has suffered a hate crime. Now you might find now, according to certain symbols, on and on and on, you may find you may be punishable from a minimum of 2 to a maximum of 10 years for the act of creating a hate crime. Now, where is the wording essentially problematic in said billing? In the act of writing a lawful statement, which this was clearly written by AI, which if AI simply understood the algorithm at which a human mind processes that direct wording in definitive patterns result in a definitive meaning, a definitive definition, which if we do not create a definitive you could say definition, utilizing the same particular wording continuously, in a law contract, you find it leaves interpretation, which according to said interpretation, an individual can essentially word said billing, no matter how they may interpret it and turn it into their favor. If a hate crime is specifically, once again classified as turning hatred, a movement, into pursuing anything that could essentially, as simply as striking the emotion of fear within an individual, as an example. And if you are an individual walking with a particular symbol, that which the interpretation of the individual self may now essentially see and feel fear, you are now guilty of a hate crime. There is a morality problem because according to not using the same language in definitive statements, instead they use interpretive statements within the said legislation. In interpretive language, rather than definitive language, it leaves the essential linguistic aspect of said Bill C-9, and it leaves it up to the interpretation of the individual to essentially use however the wording is stated, and they may create a bias from. Which according to a bias, what ends up happening if you're now represented poorly in a court of law. If you're represented poorly and they can create a different meaning based on a bias, such as a personal interpretation of said legislation, ultimately, said lawyers representing each defendant and accuser, according to the different people that may be essentially creating these laws for, we find essentially a moral compass that creates ultimately a huge problem. This bill is essentially going to cut out anything that might be a symbol in the future that arises the feeling of fear within a particular individual, which within said symbols you might find meaning, such as a pride flag or a cross. You might find a meaning behind said symbols. Now, according to, if said symbol causes an individual to feel the emotion of fear based on that symbol being presented, it does not state the list of which symbols may cause these particular feelings. It only strikes two examples, being the Nazi swastika and the SS symbol, listed as examples. This is not the complete list of symbols that you might find are not defined in said legislation, which means whether you are an individual walking with a cross manifested upon your fashion wear, whether it be your jewelry or your hat, or whether you are an individual of the LGBT community, you might find that even simply displaying your flag, the morality may change. It's up to the individual interpretation. It does not list the particular symbols that are resulting in said hatred being stemmed as a result of these particular symbols. It gives two examples, but it does not dive directly into each particular symbol, that up to the individual interpretation, I may go, whoa, I feel fear from that. And just based on that, you can now call and report a hate crime, whether you may represent your faith or your faith. Regardless of faith, whatever symbol may be a result of essentially just creating out of representing a symbol, nameless symbols, which within a bill, if you do not have a definitive action that which is supportive of the essential definitive meaning of said interpretive interaction known as the response of the individual. If you leave the interpretation of a particular definitive statement and you create a interpersonable statement, you may interpret it individually, which in individual interpretation, ultimately the ego is the deciding factor. In the definitive factor, which is the response, based on interpretation, said individual then takes an action. And when you look at a particular bill, the A stands for the interpretation. The B stands for the action in response to said A. So when you were to look at now bills going A, B, C, D, every A, B, C, D, you might find the first of the two dualities is the interpretation, which now when you look at the statement below is the action, which upon the interpersonation of whichever way you might individually interpersonate, in an impersonable way, you might essentially create more hate crimes, which is going to result in Canadian civilization and ultimately individuals no longer stepping out of their homes. Why do I want to go in the world? Everywhere there's going to be a hate crime. People will essentially once again be confined to particular individual houses. Segregation, where nobody will leave their homes going forward. And the moment people no longer leave their homes, what happens? What's going to essentially sustain civilization at this particular point? And this is just me creating and prophesizing an idea into your head that if we pursue this idea, we might actually actualize it by pursuing a poorly worded bill, such as Bill C-9. Ultimately, the interpretation is left to the individual because it does not have definitive statements. It can be left up to interpretation. And the moment we no longer define things in a definitive way, you might find one particular fact. Whether a doctor or a lawyer study in order to create their practice, what might be a particular language you derive said interactions of meaning from? You would derive it from Latin, because in each Latin word is the direct definition of particular said word, said meaning, the definitive definition. Whereas if you now change it to a different language, the more we change language and the more we essentially create interpretation within the individual self, which according to the individual self, one thing now may be another and the other thing may be another without a particular definition. And in the word of itself, you might find that hatred can take on different definitions throughout the entire Bill C-9, which in the entire Bill C-9, the definition of hatred might be initially stated, but it is exponentially developed into different meanings of what could ultimately result in the overall statement known as Bill C-9, which is the Criminal Acts Code presented in Bill C-9 to prevent hate crimes based on symbols or ideologies that might result in groups of population essentially not getting along. And based on individuals not getting along because we simply just can't seem to function without causing problems in our societies nowadays. Everybody's got to be triggered about one particular thing. everybody has to be triggered about one thing or the other nowadays. Nobody can simply just coexist. And we wonder why we have so many wars. In the understanding of Bill C-9, in the interpersonable interpretation of the language, which is not a constant, you can individually, interpersonably, interpersonate it, which means you can kind of just eventually play it in your favor, which now we're just going to have all of these ego selves going around. You committed a hate crime, you committed a hate crime, you committed a hate crime, and nobody's going to leave their houses as a result of that. Sounds fun, doesn't it? Yeah, wait till you're the one in jail for a false accusation. Because if you don't get a good lawyer, which, a good lawyer is essentially going to be able to turn said legislation in your favor. But once you result poorly developed lawyer minds, such as whoever was the individual that didn't write this Bill C-9, because you can clearly see it is an AI constructed document, which an AI constructed document resulting in human legislation does not carry the same meaning in its interpersonation of said language. It does not recognize the individual singular definition and exponentially divides said definition. Initially, hatred might be an emotion of hate, but then hatred is then turned in the second definition beyond the first comma, you now see in the definition of hatred resulting in committing a particular act of violence, or so and so and so. Which now, just based on this particular hatred, if you just get into an argument and an individual feels fear as a public conversation, or even from an individual walking, and another person walking the opposite direction might go, whoa, I'm scared. They have a symbol on them. A symbol. Which from said symbols, whether it be such things even as it's not a definitive list of particular symbols, no longer permitted within said society, which means any particular individual can essentially say, your symbol's bothering me, your symbol's bothering me, your symbol's bothering me, and eventually we just turn into a bunch of a-holes. A bunch of a-holes, which from these particular personifications of interpreting said legislation, however you may essentially discover that in the ego self, once again, what might be the greatest human right? The right to be until your right to be surpasses another's right to be. Which should be what the definition of a hate crime should be, would you not agree? But now, what is a hate crime? You could say any crime could be a hate crime, and that's the problem in the legislation of the left. We do not have definitive definitions anymore. We have interpersonable definitions, which means you can interpret it however way you want and create the argument based on said legislation. I am oppressed, just based on your interpretation. Which are based on your interpretation, clearly now we have 1 million people that are essentially going to be calling each other or calling the police on and on and on each other. We've entered a Nazi state. Everybody's going to be calling the cops on everybody. Oh, they wore this symbol. Oh, they said this particular thing. Oh, they have a handicap. Oh, all of these particular things. The moment we essentially realize, once again, the Canadian government is creating a genocides. In said ideology, the more we dehumanize the ability to interact within said one another, we see a particular group of individuals resulting in particular groups infinitely, as can be seen by this legislation, because now every single group is going to be pointing the fingers at one another, stating, you're creating fear in my life, you're creating me fear in my life, and the other is going to say, you're creating fear in my life, you're creating fear in my life, you're creating fear in my life, and we arrive at everybody's going to end up in jail. This is how you create a jail-like system. The moment you can interpersonally argue your case for how you interpersonate in your interpretation what the definition of things are, you can just make said definitions according to your own interpretation. And in said own interpretation, we now see everybody's going to tell each other, everybody's hating on each other. At that particular statement, what might we do as a Canadian people? We have two options. We change the legislation, or we get the hell out of Canada. Canada is turning into a Nazi-like state, and the analysis of placing historical events, that which from historical events you may find a point of comparison from said behavior. And in said behavior, what we essentially arise to is, once again, we are seeing the same type of mentality that ultimately leads to genocide. Without placing all of these invisible, interpersonable interpretations which further and further and further divide us, because there is no longer a particular definition of the meaning of each particular word. It can be interpreted at the individual level, and according to how said bill is written, we might see each individual choosing to essentially say, oh, this applies to me, oh, this applies to me, oh, this applies to me, obviously. And now we arrive at the meat of it all, which is walking each other into each other's cells. We need to reevaluate this particular bill as a Canadian system. Now you might say, well, he might just be going off on a tangent at this particular point, but I can read literature pretty dang well. And in reading said literature, you might find Bill C-9 has many problems left at the interpretation level of each individual. Thank you.